Hi everyone, Mrs. Saunders here, and I'm here to talk to you today about two techniques with writing. The first thing we're going to talk about is how to write a hook, and the second thing we're going to talk about is writing towards your audience. And these are both kind of things that are important to think about in terms of writing successfully, particularly in academic writing. So, what should a hook do? A hook, and when we say hook, we mean, an introduction to a piece of writing, right? Really, there's a lot of emphasis on the first sentence or two sentences. And so a hook is kind of used to draw the reader in. It creates intrigue into the text, and it demonstrates some level of craft in the writing choices. And by some level of craft, I mean, do you want to use you as a direct address to the reader? Do you want to choose a sentence that's short? Do you want to choose a sentence that's long? Do you want to use a sentence with complex diction? There are a lot of little formal choices I think that we are always making when we are writing, and I think a hook is a good opportunity to think about how you want to craft a single sentence. And it draws our attention to kind of the micro, choices that we make all the time when we're writing, because writing is just essentially making a series of choices over and over and over again as you create sentences, phrases, and paragraphs, and finally the essay as a whole. So the next slide, how should a hook be phrased? A good hook should create some type of interest in the text. Often this is achieved by leaving something out. And what do I mean by leaving something out? Well, I'm someone who studied creative writing for a long time. And I think when I think about hooks, I think about a lot of conversations that are had around how important the first sentence is in a short story. And a really good first sentence should kind of leave some element of a question. It should give the reader some information, but it also should create a sufficient amount of mystery that entices the reader to keep reading, right? And I think this is, an interesting skill if we try to import it into academic writing or any type of professional writing that you might be using in your life. Um, in the beginning, when you're writing something, you want to make sure you catch someone's interest. And often that can be achieved by creating some type of mystery. It's interesting now that we're seeing academic writing is changing, nonfiction writing is changing. We see a lot more writing with the use of the first person I. Um, and I think that can be, drawing the reader in with a personal anecdote or something like personal to yourself is another way to think about, how you want to draw a reader in or write a hook. But if you do, just a side note, if you're doing academic writing for other classes, make sure you check with your professor that using the first person, using an I on your essay is something that's permitted by the instructor, because I think we're at a moment now where some instructors are comfortable with that and other instructors are not. So if you do choose to use I in your paper, make sure that you check with who's ever in charge of the class. So we'll see. Oh, I'm sorry. I've taken an example here from a student paper, and this is a paper that was written, an issue analysis paper that was written on CTE, which is the kind of uh, situation in the brain with NFL players when they receive a lot of concussions. They come down with a syndrome called CTE, and it's been linked to a lot of negative brain damages and social effects. So this student decided to start his issue analysis paper with an anecdote. And you see, he wrote, my parents finally allowing me to play football in middle school was a decision that they would soon regret. And after this sentence, he kind of goes on to talk about the time when he got a concussion while playing football before leading into the larger issue he's planning on discussing, which is CTE and the NFL and kind of how different institutions have worked to kind of like cover up the syndrome by former football players. So we see this is an example of him using a personal anecdote to kind of draw us in. We also see that he this student is using the technique of giving us some information but leaving something out, right? My parents finally allowing me to play football in middle school was a decision that they would soon regret. We don't know why that they regret it yet, right? So there's some element of mystery or intrigue that's been created in a single sentence, which is something that's hard to achieve, right? But we see that this student was successful here in getting our attention. Another hook, and I took this hook from an article that was published on Longreads called The Louisiana Environmental Apocalypse Road Trip. And this first sentence reads, if you're visiting New Orleans and want to see something truly amazing, take your beer or daiquiri to go and walk a few blocks past the Superdome. You'll find a school being constructed on an old waste dump. So here we see this sentence create a sense of surprise, right? Because the initial part of the sentence is very positive. We see the phrase truly amazing. We see beer or daiquiri was associated with parties and festivals and happy times. And after the dash in the sentence, you'll find a school being constructed on an old waste dump. We see that the mood of the sentence completely shifts. So that there's a kind of a juxtaposition that's going that is kind of jarring, but it attracts our attention, right? It kind of it literally hooks the reader in and drags them into the essay, which is ultimately what we want to achieve. And we see here, just taking a look at the writer's style in terms of thinking about how we want to work on improving our own personal style, we see that the writer uses a direct address to the reader. So he calls the reader you, if you're visiting New Orleans, and then he says you'll find a school being constructed on an old waste dump. There's kind of a dash in the middle of the sentence instead of an and or another type of punctuation mark. So we see that this sentence on a craft level is very carefully and thoughtfully constructed, which is definitely a hallmark of good writing. Okay, so this last hook example is something that I took from my own writing, and this is something that I have written, or I'm in the process of writing now, a bunch of letters out to prospective agents to try to get them interested in a manuscript I've written. So you'll see I start out, my name is Vanessa, and for the past 3 years I have been writing about climate change. So you'll see that first sentence, I am trying to draw their interest in, and I guess I'm kind of betting that they're interested in reading about climate change. And I guess the reason that I chose to have that as the first sentence is because there's been a lot of natural disasters happening recently, and I think that climate change is really on the tip of the national tongue, so to speak. That's what I'm betting on. That's what I'm hoping for. Then I go on to say, a longtime fan of Roxane Gay, I thought I might be a good fit for your list. Recently, an excerpt from my manuscript, The Flat Woman, was accepted for publication in Pank, which Roxane Gay founded. The story is told in a careful and stripped style. The manuscript is only 14,500 words. So here in this passage, you see I'm trying to draw the reader in by being specific. I am specifically catering my writing to my audience. This particular agent who represents Roxane Gay, another writer that I like, who I have connections to, and I am very concrete in my intent to kind of personally address this specific agent. And I think this brings our attention to another element of craft, which is important in academic writing and it's important in professional writing, and that's being specific and being concrete. I think the less vague that you are, the more success that you will have in your career at academia and also your career, beyond academia if you choose to go beyond it, so in your professional life. And that kind of idea brings us towards our next kind of theme to consider in terms of the craft of writing, which is writing towards your audience. And I know that we've thought about intended audience and how rhetoricians and writers try to reach or cater to their intended audience in terms of their rhetorical appeals. And now we're going to think about how we, as writers, want to craft our own writing in consideration of our audience. So things to consider in terms of writing for your audience: specificity, which we saw in the last passage, being concrete again, And specificity and being concrete in academic writing tend to translate, in terms of like using specific evidence, kind of analyzing that evidence very specifically, looking at it closely, close reading skills. I think close reading is really at the heart of every really solid English essay. Another thing to think about is appropriate levels of formality. So, when you're writing an academic essay, you're always going to be writing towards an academic audience, right? But in professional writing and even in social writing, you might want to, craft things a little bit differently depending on who you're writing towards. Another thing in terms of writing towards your audience, you want to think about what vocabulary you're using, and you also want to think about curating your content according to the needs of your audience. So, these are all things that are important when we're thinking about who we're writing towards, and I think it's something that is really kind of imperative to be a successful writer. So here's another personal example. This is a different letter that I've written towards a different agent. And in terms of curating, I thought this is a good example of how I kind of shifted my narrative around what my book was about, because I thought it would better suit the particular needs of this agent. So we'll see the first sentence is the same as the initial excerpt, but then I say, an acquaintance of Miriama Lockington, I thought I might be a good fit for your list based on your interest in cross-genre literature. My manuscript, The Flat Woman, is a novel in verse that runs over 14,000 words. And then I go on to list a number of magazines that it's been published in. Just to point out some differences, so the agent that I'm writing to here is an agent who's interested in publishing poetry and novels and cross-genre literature and novels in verse, as opposed to my first agent who is only interested in publishing it as fiction. So in my initial excerpt, I'll go back to it quickly. I am thinking about marketing my manuscript as a piece of fiction, when in reality it's a bit of a cross genre. It's a mix between poetry and fiction. Whereas my second excerpt, I am thinking about marketing it as more of a poetic novel or poetry and fiction, right? And we see the difference because I openly call it cross-genre literature. I mention a bunch of magazines that it's been published in, and some of these are only poetry magazines, right? But I didn't want to tell that to the first agent, because then they would know it would be published as poetry. So here in this excerpt, I have a complete list of places it's been published in, whereas in the first excerpt, I only wanted to name fiction magazines or magazines that publish poetry and fiction. So this is an example of how I've kind of slanted my content, right, depending on who I think is going to be reading it. And this is an important skill in terms of the type of thinking that you'll be expected of you in different classes in academia, and also for professional writing. You want to make sure that you advertise things based on who's going to be listening. So I thought we'd look at an example from Letter from Birmingham Jail, which we read in our first week. So we see Martha King writes, while confined here in the Birmingham City Jail, I came across your recent statement calling our present activities unwise and untimely. Seldom, if ever, do I pause to answer criticisms of my work and ideas. If I sought to answer all of the criticisms that came across my desk, my secretaries would be engaged in little else in the course of the day, and I would have no time for constructive work. But since I feel that you are men of genuine goodwill and your criticisms are sincerely set forth, I would like to answer your statement in what I hope will be patient and reasonable terms. So here we have MLK is specifically addressing his intended audience, right? He actually really writes the letter completely to them in terms of he includes them in his you. So when he's saying, when I came across your recent statement, he's referring to a specific group of people. I believe it's the 8 members who wrote a statement calling his present activities unwise and untimely. We see that he's appropriately formal in terms of his writing style, in terms of his kind of tone and general levels, of formality, right? The style of the writing is very formal. He says, but since I feel that you are men of genuine goodwill and your criticisms are sincerely set forth, I would like to answer your statement in what I hope will be patient and reasonable terms. His tone, I think, while it is on the surface very almost polite, I think it has a sense of sarcasm as well, which ultimately suits the purpose of his letter, which is kind of a critique of their critique, his critique of their critique of him. So I think this is a good example about how he is very focused in the audience that he addresses, and he really has put a lot of thought in how he wants to formally, um, curate his content based on the audience that he's addressing. So I hope this is helpful for you guys in thinking about writing a hook and writing towards your audience. I think the main ideas are to be specific, right? Be specific in who you address, and be specific when you're making those little choices in terms of writing your hook and how you're trying to draw the reader in. All right, everyone, thank you.